So why are more and more young men veering towards traditional views, right? What's happening? I think Esther Perel said something on her Instagram recently, and I really agree with it. She said, when life becomes more and more chaotic, we seek to create stability and fixedness in our views, right? And we see this around relationships. Like, I see a lot of content online which is simplifying relationships and men for women, right? Find a provider man, find this sort of man that has this sorts of traits, simplification. And I see a lot of simplification on the man side, which usually veers into misogyny, which is like, women only want men with money and good looks, right? And that's all they want. And there's nothing else, mate value and all this kind of jazz. Now, when we simplify, it's like we're trying to grab onto something solid, right? Because we're living in this world that feels chaotic because, the gender roles have dissolved, really. They're dissolving or dissolved depending on what you look like. So as a man, now I can be a breadwinner. I could be a stay-at-home dad. I could go be a nurse. I could be a mechanic. There's less of these barriers that exist. It's like, oh, as a man, I can and can't do this. Those barriers do still exist, but they're a lot less, they're more porous than they used to be, right? It's like, nursing we see traditionally is a woman's job, right? And one of my brothers-in-law, he's a nurse. And no one bats an eyelid about it, right? I always remember that movie, is it Meet the Fockers? And I think the Ben Stiller, his name's Gaylord, isn't it, in the film? And he's a nurse, and they're always taking the piss out of him for being a nurse. I think that's really shifting, for example, right? Like women starting businesses, being CEOs and so forth, like creating money-making coaching business to help other women. So we're seeing a shift in these roles. And I think women have had the revolution, right? Which has really expanded their opportunities and what they can be. And I think for men, there's been no revolution because we weren't really oppressed as a whole, right? I think there's definitely, most men are oppressed. I think if you probably cream off the top 10%, there's a lot of oppression that has occurred to men. Working class men have had very little opportunities in their life. People of color, men, also, there's oppression there. And I think sometimes we ignore that oppression because it isn't as obvious as oppression that women experience as well, right? But though it's still valid and valuable to look at to understand men more deeply. But the roles are shifting and changing, and it's destabilizing. And I think for a lot of men, they're kind of flailing, like they're looking for a code, a rule book of how to be a man. I remember I've got a book here. It's an old book called Mr. Jones's Rules. It was written by the then editor of GQ. And I read this book, and it basically is like, this is what you do to be a man. And I think a lot of young men, and I see this when I go into schools and speak to young men, they're like, tell me how to be a good man. Tell me how to be a man. Like, write it down simply. Because, and this is where the misogyny pipeline is so enticing, is because it simplifies. Make lots of money, be strong, be good looking, sleep with lots of women, and that makes you a man. That's roughly what it's saying a lot of the time, right? I say this because as someone I would say that I definitely believed in those tenets to some lesser or more degree when in my younger years. A lot of young men are often looking for simplicity and to understand how the world is. And when we live in the world now, which has dissolved a lot of the very obvious rules we used to live by, it can feel chaotic to them. And when someone's selling them like, this is going to give you money, success, and women, it's very seductive, it's very seductive for them to follow. What else is happening to young men? I think there's also, we can't ignore the economic instability that we're living in, right? I think I read somewhere that to buy a house in the UK is 7.7 times the average wage. In comparison to like 1990, it was like 3 point something, I think. I can't be exact on those numbers, but it was very low. And for someone who owns property and has seen how property is increased, but not in line with wages, if I was a 20-something man now, I might feel like there's no chance. When I was 20-something, people were talking like there's no chance to get on the housing ladder and so forth, right? But I look down now and I got a younger brother who's 19, and I'm like, wow, like that's tough. I've got younger sisters who are in their early 30s. Like it's tough. It's a different landscape. It's not impossible, there are jobs that are good paying jobs, but we're also seeing AI, right? And I've spoken to a lot of people in tech and in finance, and they're like, a lot of the junior roles are disappearing because AI can just do those roles. A senior engineer can just have a couple of AIs or one AI he's working with that can do the job of the junior. So we're also seeing jobs disappear that were once there. House prices are going up, wages are stagnating. People are also able to see, young boys are able to see the wealth that they're not making. We can see footballers in a way we've never seen before. We see actors, we see people on Instagram. We should not discount the amount of flossing, as it used to be called in my day, or stunting, as it might be called now, of people on Instagram that creates this desire and feeling that I should have that. Yeah. And we can't remove that from the fact that male identities and man's identity is still highly connected to competence and provision. Yeah, we still judge men on their capacity to provide, right? Yeah, is expanding, and I know a lot of women, if you're listening to this, you're going to be like, yeah, but I want a man who's got emotional intelligence, blah blah blah. You do. I don't disagree with you, but there are large swaths of women, right? Just remember, when you're middle class with your nice university degree and your middle income life that you've been born into, there's people that are on the other side of you, the lower end of earnings, the lower end of education, that would just love to be in a stable household. And I say this as someone who grew up around people who grew up around environments of instability, financial instability, and what that does to you, and just desiring a partner who can provide financial stability. So I think there's still a lot of women that desire that. And I think sometimes we ignore that end of the provisioning and the importance of it. So men still feel their identity is tied to provision and competence and provision, right? So if you can't get a job, you don't think you're going to be able to get a job in the future that pays well, that's going to look after your family, that's going to give you the things you want, and you're already, in your early 20s, you're going to feel incompetent and like you'll never be able to succeed and provide for the family you want. So this can lead to us looking in places for people that have the answer, and we're back to misogyny pipeline, right? Another factor I'm seeing in this kind of men swinging towards traditional views is around dating. There's a huge amount of anxiety around dating, around, there's a lot of messages, again, coming from the red pill community and the manosphere around women dating up all the time, that status determines your attractiveness, that money determines your attractiveness, that men are all in competition with each other for a limited resource of women, right? This creates a huge amount of anxiety for a lot of men, right? Because they already don't feel good enough. They already feel they're failing economically. Maybe they've come from a history of failing at school, right? Because boys in particular, were lagging behind girls at school massively, right? Which is another big problem that's occurring. So you're creating this dating anxiety as well. And then you've got this aspect of this misogyny pipeline, this radicalization that's occurring on Instagram and social media. Like, let me tell you, I sometimes go to some of what we might call, more right-wing, whatever word you want to use it, more right-leaning, traditional. And I start looking at these reels because I'm thinking, do I want to do a reaction to this? What do I think about this? And then suddenly Instagram just gets more and more extreme. And this is just me on my profile, on my personal, well, not personal, on my business account. And I'm like, wow, suddenly we've gone from like, this right-wing view might not be in line. And suddenly we're like, women should only, I'm looking at trad wife and trad husband content. Yeah. You see how quickly we can veer. Or something that I noticed recently, I started to look at women who, and I always have this affiliation for women who are seeking to understand men and not just blame all men for the world's problems. And then suddenly it's just showing me more and more women who had this kind of point of view, but to the point where it's like, women are like, men aren't the problem, women are the problem. And I was like, wow, how did I get down here? And most of us are not trained in this media literacy to be like, what's going on here? We just scroll in this kind of hypnotic way and absorbing content. And if I was a young man and I'm lonely, I'm rejected, I can't meet the women I want to, right? I'm going to search for answers, and the algorithm gives you answers. And I know a lot of you are going to go, well, if that man was, more emotionally attuned, was a feminist and blah, 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 he'd be okay. And I want to just signpost at something I've seen for a lot of guys is like, they see that's how to put it. It's like expecting someone who has been told not to learn Spanish their whole life to speak Spanish fluently. That's the equivalent we're asking for men to be really emotionally attuned and emotionally aware, because we spend our whole lives having it kind of beaten out of us through the school system, through our society and so forth, around men and emotions. I always say this: when you have a gift for something that comes naturally to you, that you've just learned through your life, it's really easy to you, and you can never really understand why other people struggle to learn it. And that's kind of how it is: emotional attunement, emotional literacy, emotional mastery for a lot of men, not all men, but a lot of men. So you find these guys who are lonely, maybe they struggled in school, they feel rejected, like they feel ostracized from society. They're on Instagram and they see all this angry content about men and how useless men are, how predators men are, and how worthless they are. And that messaging seeps into their minds. I don't know any statistics around this, right? But this is probably something I really want you to hear: is I often wonder, what is the impact of the general negative perception of men that is given free reign, right? You can say what you want about men. Let's be honest, you can be as misandrous as you want on online forums and in person. You can talk about hating men and proudly talk about hating men. And I'm not discounting the shitty things that men do in the slightest, but in this is like, what is the impact on our minds when we consume this content? What does this do to young boys when they see all this content about how useless men are? Because ultimately young boys are men. They're becoming men. How does it impact their self-view of themselves? Right. And I guess on women's side, is like, what does it does for young women and women who are adult women? What does it do to their minds when they're constantly bombarded with these stories of how misogynist, how negative, how bad, how useless men are? What does it do to them? I don't know the answer to that question. If you're a behavioral psychologist or someone like that who knows, contact me. We'll have a conversation on the podcast. I'd love to have a conversation about that. But I suspect it's not a good thing, right? Because it's not a balanced view that they're getting, right? Like I said, 30% of men, over 30% of Gen Z men identify as feminists, right? We don't put much attention towards that. Yeah. And if you're not meeting men directly who, are viewed that way, or see themselves that way, you might not believe they exist. Or even worse, you might meet them and you might believe, oh, they are woke baiting. I think it's called woke baiting, where a man in particular will pretend to be more liberal than he actually is to snare women, right? So we've got all these forces at work that's pushing men to be more radical, right? Or not radical isn't the word, maybe more traditional.